Right, greetings, hello, welcome. So welcome to this week's Philosophy Club here in France, in La Creuse, where there's been a lot of action recently in France. People have probably seen there's protests on the streets, and I've got a solution that I'm going to try and put to Macron about that, which might calm the temperature. Before we start with looking at the dyads, we're going to be looking again at the dyads and the relationships between different traditions, either religious or philosophical, and the tension and the creative relationships between them. Before we do that, I'm going to just run through with you a few books that I use as reference books, because I would like people to be able to go away and do their own research, and I just want to explain where this knowledge comes from, because this table that we're looking at each week is the most comprehensive attempt as yet to put all the world's philosophical and religious traditions in one simple table. Nobody's thought of it, and nobody's done it yet. No, I tell a lie. One guy thought of it, very clever chap, but he never actually did it. He wrote a few papers about, we ought to do this, but then tied himself up in knots about, yeah, but how can we do it, and blah, blah, blah. And it never got done, because you can wait at the level of theory and not actually do it. I just said, well, let's do it. And we'll do theory later. So anyway, where does the information come from? So I began this based on like 30 years, 40 years of study of philosophy. I started quite young, in my late teens, studying philosophy, and I went to the University of Bristol and studied philosophy there in the 70s. But I was interested in philosophy as a lifestyle, as a path, as a spiritual journey. And I realised that the Bristol University in those days, they weren't. So I actually resigned from the university faculty to go and live philosophy, that's what I said, and walked to Stonehenge, which is where I began my interest in Druidry. And I was already interested in Buddhism, practicing meditation and yoga and Sufism and so on. So I was also living philosophy. And I met spiritual, sages in all those different traditions. And then ever since, I went back obviously and studied at the University of London for another degree in history and history of ideas. But most of my really important work was done in Canada at the University of Calgary in the late 70s, early 80s, independently, using the resources of the library at the University of Calgary in Canada, which is an amazing library. I mean, it's got all the classics, everything I'm talking about. And I read them all. Since then, a discipline has developed called comparative philosophy or comparative global philosophy. So what I'm drawing on is a sort of study of comparative global philosophy, which you couldn't do at Bristol. I mean, it was just straight on diet of very narrow-minded logical positivism and Wittgenstein, which dominated British academic philosophy at the time. And I rebelled against that. I wanted global, universal philosophy. So, and there are people doing it. So I just want to share a few of the sources I've drawn on. And they're not in any sort of order of importance. The first one I want to share is in French, for my French readers and listeners. This is Dictionnaire de l'Ésotérisme, edited by Jean Servier, and it includes work, it's published by the University Press of France, and it's an A to Z dictionary printed in 2013, with all the sort of leading French intellectuals who've done surveys of all these different world religious and philosophical traditions, particularly from the esoteric traditions, so like alchemy. They break that down. They have an entry on Chinese alchemy, Islamic alchemy, Christian alchemy, etc., etc. Alchemy in the Middle Ages, alchemy in modern times, and so on. So this is an absolutely amazing source, 1,000 pages or more. The key thinkers behind this is a guy called Antoine Fèvre, who was professor of esoteric history of ideas at the Sorbonne, at the University of Paris. So there are people in France doing this work. This is an amazing book I've had for years by an English philosopher called Raymond Williams, who was for many years Professor of English at the University of Cambridge, where my daughter's studying. This is a book called Key Words, a vocabulary of culture and society. And it was first published in the 1970s when I was beginning my study in all this, 1976. He was a really brilliant thinker. I met him, I heard him talk. In this dictionary, he studies the language we use for philosophy. So he has words like ideology, genius, existential, equality, dialectic, culture, democracy, class, bourgeois, sex, progressive, and so on. He takes apart the vocabulary that we use for philosophical debate, particularly political philosophy. He was on the left. He was a Labour Party supporter, like me, and but he was a highly intellectual guy who was also a forerunner of the Green movement, because he was writing about sort of green-red alliance way back in the 70s. And he, for instance, the entry on objective and subjective, which we use a lot in philosophy, we say, oh, that's objective, that statement of yours, that's objective truth. And then you can dismiss somebody's argument and say, no, that's just subjective, that's just your view, you know. Well, he reveals in this book that the meanings have become reversed over the last 1,000 years. If I was teaching at the University of Paris and it's 1250 AD with Abelard, if I say something is subjectively true, that meant it was really true because it was endorsed by the spiritual world. And because in those days people knew spirituality is real. And therefore if I say, no, that's really subjectively true, it meant the angels, the saints, the sages, we all knew it was true. If I said, oh no, that's just objectively true, it meant that's just something you can measure, anybody can fake that, it's just material stuff, that's not real. It's only the subjective experience of the human soul that's real. So that's what European philosophers used to think 1,000 years ago. And of course, he explains how that became then reversed with the fashionable kind of materialist scientism of the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. So the word subjective became a term of disrepute, and the word objective became, you know, de rigueur. That's why Raymond Williams' work is absolutely brilliant. He was a genius, long dead, sadly, but his work lives on. This is another book which I use and have used, which inspired me a great deal over the years. It's called The Great Initiates, a study of the secret history of religions. I remember reading this book, finding it when I was in London in the early 80s, having come back. I worked at the National Hospital of Nervous Diseases, and I had time to study, you know, I was on night shift a lot. It was right by the British Museum, which I was studying in the daytime. And then at night I was working at the hospital in Queen's Square. And I remember reading this book and just between turning patients and making sure they're all okay, being absolutely blown away. Edward Schuré lived near Strasbourg. He was French, but also German. He was from Alsace-Lorraine. He regarded himself as a European intellectual. He was, like Schweitzer. He was a friend of many of the great intellectuals of his day. And he wanted to understand from within what is the religious history of mankind from within. So this book studies sages like Rama and Krishna in India, Hermes in Egypt, Moses and the mission of Israel, Orpheus, Pythagoras, the founder of philosophy, Plato, and Jesus. And what he does is these little essays, each of which is about 50 pages long. It's an imaginative reconstruction of their lives and thought, based on all that was known archaeologically and historically from the texts. But then he goes into it sort of subjectively, trying to commune with their spirit and saying, well, what actually did Jesus mean when he did that Sermon on the Mount? And he tries to reconstruct it. Anyway, it's a work of genius. And I discovered later, I fell in love with this book. Nobody I knew had ever heard of it. I discovered it was the favourite book of the mother of Prince Philip, who was married to Queen Elizabeth II, and who was herself a bit of a mystic, interesting woman. I met Prince Philip, and I didn't talk to him about the book, but I was there in St James's Palace talking about some interfaith piecework I was doing with a publishing house that were launching some books, and I think Philip inherited from his mother an interest in spirituality. Although he's a Christian, he's very interested in all different religions. And he was also a Freemason as well, which is a bit of a giveaway that the man is quite universal in his thinking. So I got on really well with Philip, and I think it was because his mother loved that book so much. And I think the current king, Charles III, has inherited this streak of interest in mysticism and the esoteric traditions of religion. And of course we have a whole section in the table called esoteric. So that was inspired partly by Shure. Another book that's inspired me a lot, this is a companion to world philosophies. This is Blackwell's, a great publishing house, edited by Elliot Deutsch, who's a pioneer in this field. This was published back in the late 90s. Chapters on Chinese philosophy, which is like the pink ones, Indian philosophy, which is the yellow, but it's broad. It's got classical Polynesian thinking, African philosophy, Buddhist philosophy, Islamic, and it goes into great detail on all these different world philosophies, African as well. So this is another book that I've used, which has inspired me. When I was studying philosophy at university, those books didn't exist. They looked at you like you were crazy if you wanted to study world philosophy. Here's another pioneering book called Philosophy in World Perspective by David A. Dilworth. This is a classic, a comparative hermeneutic of the major theories. And what Dilworth, and I got really excited when I discovered this book, it's Yale University Press, 1989. I love it when he calls one of his chapters a prolegomena to any future hermeneutic. So hermeneutic means the interpretation of these different philosophies. And he's borrowed that phrase from Kant. A prolegomena means like a foreword to anyone else that wants to write a sort of hermeneutic. Like, how should we study this? How should we interpret it? What categorizations can we use? Well, he's sort of laid out the groundworks. And he creates what he calls an architecture of theories. And at one point I was going to model my doctoral thesis on what I call the architectonic of wisdom in the different world traditions. It's a very ambitious thesis I put together. I was going to look at the notion of wisdom in all of these traditions and sort of study what kind of wisdom is it promoting. Is it a wisdom that we can understand? Is it a sort of enlightenment experience, subjective? Is it a gradual thing that we have to do together, like science? And that was partly inspired by this book. I decided to go a slightly different track because that was a bit too complex for my doctoral advisors. They just couldn't understand what I was trying to do. So I backed off and did a straight history of 50 years on the search for peace. But I smuggled in the question of transpersonal history into the thesis, which is kind of what I'm doing. This is another great book, Dane Rudyard, who was a planetary-wide thinker, visionary, musician, esotericist, astrologer, cosmic citizen. The planetarization of consciousness. I mean, that gives away the book. He's saying, gradually, from these separate tribes, I don't care if you're, sort of a Druid Celt or a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Jewish rabbi or whatever, from all these different tribes, we're gradually coming to a planetary-wide perspective. And that's a process in consciousness itself. That's happening. As Hegel said, that's the law of history. We are waking up to a planetary-wide perspective. And he explains how and why and what the implication is. Then we come to my dear friend John Plott, I discovered this book in a wonderful bookshop opposite the British Museum in London, which imports Indian books. I used to go in there and spend hours and hundreds of pounds buying amazing Indian import books until I started going to India and bringing my own back. But John Plott was an amazing guy. He got a BA degree at the University of Oklahoma, joined the Society of John the Evangelist, an Anglican monastic society in Ontario in Canada, studied at the University of Chicago, and then went to India and did a PhD at the Banaras Hindu University in Benares, which I've also been to. And all this made him become a world thinker. And he set out to write the global history of philosophy, like all philosophy, everywhere, in all countries, in all religions. And I admire the guy. I never met him. And he did write a bibliographical guide to the global history of philosophy, which I treasured. You know, I mean, I've had this book. This has been like under my pillow for years. And of course, he died before he could finish the book. He never completed it because it's almost unfinishable, a global history of philosophy. You'd have to put everyone, all the great thinkers from all civilizations and cultures. In a sense, in this table, I've sort of finished his work by at least providing a grid so people can kind of begin to make sense of it. What Plott did, and of course he was writing in the days before the internet. I mean, he published this volume in 1963, right, in Delhi. He made these amazing charts that went with his books, which I've got. I've got some on the walls here in the museum, showing timelines, like 1,000 years, all the great philosophers in each epoch, in the different civilizations. So at the time when Abelard was teaching in Paris in the 1200s, who was teaching in the Islamic world? Who was teaching in the Chinese world? Who was researching in Indian philosophy and so on? And so you can see visually how they all map. And those charts inspired me to sort of carry on with that work and do it in even more detail, which in a sense was the forerunner to the table here. So thank you, John. He's no doubt in the Heavenly Library, carrying on with his charts. Okay, here's another one, an introduction to comparative philosophy. Lovely, humble title. You know, we all have to be humble doing this work because nobody can complete it. This is by an Indian philosopher called P.T. Raju, published by Motilal Banarsidass Publishers in Delhi, which I visited. It's my favourite, publishing house in India. They've offered to publish some of my work. I just haven't decided which one to give them. And he's sort of doing what I'm doing. He's saying, how can we compare these different traditions? Chinese, Buddhist, Hindu, and so on. You know, how do we have a evaluation criteria? Like, is one of them best, or are they all just appropriate to their cultures? Those are, big questions, right? And in a sense, what I've done by doing the periodic table of the world's religious and philosophical traditions is I've made it easier for future people that come along, the next generation of Rajus. They don't have to reinvent the wheel. They can use the table, all the facts and data are there, and then they can write their, how we compare and contrast them, going forward. And also in the new religious movements, there are going to be new ones probably, in the next 100, 200 years. New things will come along, and new hermeneutics, I hope. For example, I just got to say this. I've been doing some research for a book I'm writing, and I've just discovered that the last Pope, Benedict, really didn't like Freemasonry, and he said it's evil. Right? Well, come on, Benedict. Hundreds of thousands of great philosophers and thinkers have been Freemasons. You can't just say it's evil. That's really medieval kind of thinking, with all due respect. So I'm hoping that in a new hermeneutic, people will be a bit more polite about each other's traditions. And instead of saying, oh, they're all evil, you might say, well, actually, they're quite interesting. They have their own history. Let's study them, and let's have a conference, and let's look at Catholic Masonic history and, look at the interweaving complexities. Because in the 18th century, many great French intellectuals were both Catholic and Freemasons, and still are today. You know, so what's not to like about that? So less of this "they're evil" stuff, please. So that's a new hermeneutic. It's called a hermeneutic of peace that I'm proposing. Right, here we have Talking Philosophy, a word book, right? Because I realised very early on that to really understand philosophy, you have to understand the language. All of these boxes have different linguistic matrices. You know, obviously the Chinese philosophers wrote in Chinese, Japanese in Japanese, Indian in Sanskrit or Pali or whatever, and Europeans tended to write in ancient Greek or Latin and then modern languages and so on. So you have to know the basics of them all. And I produced the first ever comparative dictionary of all different languages for philosophical terms. I was inspired to do it by this book, Talking Philosophy, which is just applied to the English language. But of course, most English philosophical words go back to either Greek or Latin. So you can't, because I studied Greek and Latin, you know, I can understand the language. But then, being a restless kind of guy, I wanted to know the Chinese, the Japanese, the Sanskrit, the Hebrew, the Arabic, and so on and so on. You know, the Etruscan, the Babylonian, the ancient Norse, the Korean, and the American Indian languages. I mean, I haven't yet finished that book, the Comparative Dictionary of Philosophical Terminology in All Languages. It's like Plot, it's unfinishable by just one guy. Then we come to this book, which is, if you spent time studying with me, you'll know about this book, The Universal Calendar of Saints and Sages. So what I've done in this book is it's the who's who that goes with the table, because each column is a different lineage tradition. So like Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, Christianity, and Freemasonry, and esoteric thought, and so on. They've all got their own columns: Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam, and so on, and Judaism. And then each day of the year, we have one from each of those traditions. So the columns go vertically, and then each day of the year, you read across the columns, and you've got one representative from each one. There's a pagan column as well. And, you know, so for instance, on the, well, today, what's today? The 26th of March, I think, isn't it?
Yes.
26th of March today, the columns are, I won't read the whole lot, just to give you a flavour. So, that's quite cool. So for Christians today, and by the way, it's the calendar of saints and sages, so it's not just saints officially, it's sages that ought to be regarded as saints, in my opinion. And of course, each religious tradition has its own system of elevating somebody to be a saint or a sage. In the Catholic tradition, it's a formal process where, you know, somebody comes along and says, they examine your life, and also, have there been any miracles associated with you? To be a Catholic saint, you have to do miracles after you're dead, which is quite challenging, but, you know, apparently it works. And then in the Anglican Church, it's slightly different, you know, and then in other Protestant churches, it's different again. In the Islamic world, there's no such thing as a formal saint, but sages, imams, Sufis are accepted as saints, like Ibn Arabi and Rumi and all the great sages of Islam. You know, they're accepted as saints, but there's not a formal thing. And the same in Judaism. You don't get to be a formal saint, but people just admire and respect you, like Isaac Luria, the great Kabbalist, or Moses, or the prophets. You know, they're not officially saints, but they effectively are. Anyway, so the Christian one for today is Thomas Davidson, who is a fascinating guy, I discovered. He was a 19th century philosopher. He was Scottish, but he spent a lot of time in America. And he gave lectures, and he was a bit of a freelance philosopher, a bit like me. He never had a formal, well, I don't think for long, a formal academic teaching post. So that meant he was free to roam about. He was a genius who integrated all philosophy he could get his hands on. And he came up with some visionary stuff. He gave a lecture in London once, and the people that came to the talk founded a thing called the Brotherhood of the New Life, which was going to be like a society to improve the world. And out of that came the Fabian Society, which was the foundation of the Labour Party in Britain. These were intellectuals that wanted to use learning for the betterment of society, to make society more equal and just and fair, to advance the status of women, to help the unemployed, to create social insurance systems and stuff. And it was the Fabian Society that founded the London School of Economics and Political Science, the LSE we call it, where I did part of my studies, and my two little daughters went to the nursery there. So Thomas Davidson was a great visionary philosopher who, deserves to be better known. We have Heinrich Zimmer, who was a great Indologist, friend of Carl Jung, inspired me a great deal. We have Charles Coulomb, a chemist, 1736 to 1806, a physical scientist. We have Gwydion, who was a druid and a seer in Wales. We have an Islamic sage, Jalaluddin Makhdoom, 1285. We have Melvin Calvin, who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1961 for discovering the reactions underlying photosynthesis. And when I used to go and occasionally sit in on science classes or teach in my school career, I learned all about how incredibly complex photosynthesis is. And we depend on it for everything. The plants, their ability to capture sunlight and transform it into sugars that we can then eat, and that gives us energy. It all depends on this thing. And this one guy, he cracked it, worked out how it's done. Unbelievably complex. Chinese guy Tai Tzu, great Jain Umasvati, Jain saint. A French intellectual, Lefebvre d'Etaples, who was a Platonic Hermetic thinker in the French Renaissance, absolute genius. Roger Coates, who published the second edition of Newton's Principia and was a Freemason, 1682 to 1716. And Anne-Marie Dacier, a French scholar, a woman. Women have their own column because often they don't get enough look in the formal religions. And she was a French woman who translated Aristotle, Plato, Plutarch and Horace into French, which is like mind-boggling, right? So we celebrate all them today, and so on, each day of the year, different bunch. And so these are the intellectuals that they're the sort of crème de la crème, if you want, of the periodic table. And that book, therefore, it sort of goes with the table. Then we have, just as an example, we have a Plato dictionary. I think Plato is probably, one of the greatest of all the thinkers. I mean, I may be biased because I'm European and he was our greatest European philosopher, but I think he was a great thinker, partly because he was so he didn't promote himself. His dialogues don't even mention him. He doesn't even get a speaking part. He promoted Socrates, his teacher, instead. But without Plato's amazing writing, we wouldn't know anything hardly about Socrates. So he was very humble in that respect. And he founded the academy, of course, in Greece, which is the origin of the word academic. And I hope I'm an academic. I've been to the place where the original academy was physically located. Archaeologists have found it in Athens, where they would have lectures like this, and for 1,000 years. And then the fanatical Byzantine Christian emperors, who were basically not intellectuals, it has to be said, they just closed it all down to try and stop philosophy. But hey, the philosophy club in Betet is still going strong. And then there's this book, which they're all amazing, but this one has inspired me a great deal. This is called the Dictionary of Gnosis and Western Esotericism. And it's by a team, but edited by Wouter Hanegraaff, who is a great Dutch scholar who teaches at the University of Amsterdam, where they have a chair for esoteric philosophy. And it's like a who's who to the entire history of Western philosophy, esoteric thought, and Gnosticism, and all stations between, Freemasonry, Rosicrucians, all the esoteric stuff that's in the table, is referenced in more detail in this book. Now, I discovered this book in 2013 on my way to the World Congress of Philosophy in Athens, because the World Congress of Philosophy takes place every 5 years. I've been to several of them. They take place at different places around the world. That one happened in Athens. And the next one is going to be in Rome. I'm going to go to that one. And there's going to be about 1,000 philosophers from all over the world meeting in Rome. So, put it in your diaries. And we'll be discussing the philosophy of peace. I'm going to be meeting with colleagues from all over the planet. And when I went to the 2013 meeting, the last one was in Beijing, and I couldn't go to that one, it's a bit too far, although I was invited. I was on my way to Athens. I decided to fly to Naples and spend some time in the University of Naples, where Thomas Aquinas taught and studied, and where Vico, the great Italian philosopher from the 1700s, was based. So, and I went to the philosophy faculty and I saw this book on the shelves in the philosophy department in Naples, and I almost died from excitement because I didn't even know it existed. It's expensive, books like this, and because so anyway, I got very excited, read it, spent half the day browsing it, and then ordered my own copy, and I've had it ever since, and it's a really important book. Oops. And I just want to end with this. This is a book in Dutch, written by a monk, Gerrit Erden, who lives down the road in a monastery from here. And I went to see him a few Sundays ago, and he gave me this book, which is about the Cistercian way of life, which is one of the great Christian orders. And it has a monastery down the road. It could house about 50 or 100 monks, but he's the only guy living there. This is box 140, Religious Orders. The Cistercians are amazing. And he's living a life like a medieval monk. He looks exactly like this, long white beard. He could be something out of the 1200s. And he's just living a couple of miles down the road. But the guy speaks fluent Latin. He's a scholar. He speaks Dutch, French, English, you name it. He's translating works from Latin into modern languages, going into all the obscure philosophers of the Middle Ages. And it's like, talking to him is like you're sitting there talking to St. Bernard of Clairvaux. And we had a long discussion about why Abelard and St. Bernard of Clairvaux didn't like each other very much. Bernard felt you had to feel your way to God, had to just love Christ and everything will be fine. Abelard said, yes, but also you've got to do some rational thinking and some intellectual work. And he coined the word intellecting as a verb. And when I was at the Vatican Library in Rome, I saw a book by Abelard called Intellecting in Latin. And so we were chatting about this stuff down the road in the monastery. So I just want to end with that. This work is living. There are people, and of course if I was in India I could go and talk to Hindu sages, and I have done, or Jain, or if I was in Tibet or Bhutan, talk to Buddhists. This is a planetary-wide work we're all trying to do here. And may it flourish, and may we succeed in that work. Right, okay, I wanted to share those. And then there's this book, I can't forget this one. A Magician's Companion, Bill Whitcomb, a practical encyclopedic guide to magical and religious symbolism. This is a brilliant masterpiece of a book, and it uses numbers. So it says, what is the key number of your religious system? Is it 2?